The crack of 8M1 Garand rifles split the cold November air in perfect unison, and 2,000 people held their breath in the sacred silence that followed. White headstones stretched in precise rows toward the gray horizon, each one marking a life given in service, each one standing at eternal attention beneath the American flags that rippled in the morning wind. The honor guard moved through their ceremonial drill with the mechanical precision expected of soldiers who had trained for months to honor the dead, their movements sharp, their faces blank with concentration, their rifles catching the pale autumn light as they executed each position. Vernon Tate stood at the edge of the public viewing area, his threadbare army field jacket pulled tight against the cold, his breath forming small clouds that dissipated into the November morning. He had walked 4 miles to reach this ceremony, his cracked leather boots leaving prints in the frost that covered the cemetery grass. And now he stood among families clutching photographs and flowers, among veterans wearing caps embroidered with the names of wars most Americans had forgotten, among children too young to understand why their parents were crying. He did not belong to any of them. He belonged only to the dead. His eyes tracked the honor guard detail with an intensity that decades of living on the streets had not diminished. 7 rifles moved as one organism, a single expression of grief made physical through discipline and repetition. But the 8th rifle, the one held by a young soldier on the far end of the formation, was a fraction of a second late on the shoulder arms. The error was invisible to every civilian watching. It would have been invisible to most soldiers. But to Vernon, whose hands had performed this exact movement more than 10,000 times, whose muscles still remembered the weight of the M14 he had carried for 15 years at the tomb of the unknown soldier, the mistake screamed across the ceremonial ground like a wound in the fabric of something sacred. His hands twitched to the sides, fingers curling around a phantom rifle that existed only in memory. "Breathe on, too," he whispered to no one, his voice barely audible even to himself. "Move on 3. The ceremony continued. A chaplain spoke words that Vernon had heard at 100 such gatherings, words about sacrifice and honor and the debt that could never be repaid. Gold Star families wept in the front rows, clutching folded flags that had covered the caskets of sons and daughters and husbands and wives. Politicians sat in positions of prominence, their faces arranged in expressions of solemn respect that would photograph well for their campaign materials. And behind the rope line, among the anonymous masses who had come to remember, a 70-year-old homeless man watched the honor guard with eyes that missed nothing. If you're watching this story from anywhere in the world, we would love to know where you are joining us from. Leave a comment below telling us your city or country. You might be surprised to learn that quiet legends exist in every community, men and women whose humble appearances hide extraordinary stories of service and sacrifice. Perhaps you have passed one of them on your own streets without ever knowing what they carried inside them. Consider subscribing to our channel if stories like this one speak to you. Your support helps us share more true accounts that honor the forgotten heroes among us. Now, let us continue. The young soldier with the timing problem was perhaps 19 years old, his face still carrying the softness of adolescence beneath the rigid discipline of his expression. Private First Class, Vernon judged from the insignia barely visible beneath the ceremonial gloves. New to the honor guard, probably assigned within the last month, still learning the weight of what it meant to carry a rifle in a place where every movement was a prayer for the dead. The boy was trying. Vernon could see that much. He was trying with everything he had, and it was almost enough. The formation shifted, the soldiers moving to a new position that would bring them closer to the rope line where Vernon stood. The rifles came up in unison, 8 barrels pointed at the gray sky, and this time Vernon watched the young soldier specifically, watched his chest, watched his breathing pattern. The boy was holding his breath on the second count instead of releasing it, and the tension in his diaphragm was causing his arms to move a half beat early on the 3rd count. A simple error, an invisible error to anyone who had not spent a lifetime perfecting the same movements. But in this place, on this ground, surrounded by the graves of men and women who had given everything, even invisible errors carried weight. The formation passed within 10 feet of Vernon's position, close enough that he could see the individual threads of the young soldier's uniform, close enough that he could smell the gun oil on the rifles and the boot polish that gleamed despite the morning frost. As the soldiers executed their turn, the young private's eyes flickered toward the crowd for just a moment, a natural human impulse that his training had not yet fully suppressed, and in that moment his gaze met Vernon's. Vernon saw himself in those eyes. He saw the boy he had been 50 years ago, standing his first formation, terrified of making a mistake that would dishonor the dead he had sworn to protect. He saw the weight of expectation, the desperate need to be worthy of the uniform, the knowledge that every movement mattered in ways that civilians could never understand. The formation moved past, but Vernon's eyes stayed on the young soldier. During the next transition, when the honor guard shifted to allow the chaplain to approach the ceremonial wreath, the young private passed within arm's reach of the rope line. Vernon spoke without thinking, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had given orders in places where orders meant the difference between life and death. "Your third count is rushing," he said, his words barely above a whisper, but pitched to carry exactly as far as they needed to. "Breathe on 2. Move on 3. Let the breath release before your arms engage." The young soldier's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. His training told him to ignore civilians, to maintain the blank ceremonial expression that transformed individual men into a single instrument of honor. But something in Vernon's voice, something in the precision of his observation, made the boy hesitate. He gave the smallest nod, a movement so slight that only Vernon could have seen it, and then he was past, rejoining his formation, preparing for the next sequence. Vernon watched. The rifles came up. The young soldier's chest expanded on the second count, and this time, on the exhale, his arms moved in perfect synchronization with the other 7 soldiers. The crack of the rifles was singular, unified, a sound that honored the dead with the perfection they deserved. Vernon allowed himself a small nod of satisfaction. The boy had listened. The boy had trusted the word of a stranger, had made the adjustment in the span of a single breath, had transformed an almost perfect movement into something flawless. It was a small thing. It was everything. Across the ceremonial ground, a man in captain's insignia had been watching the exchange. His name was Raymond Bosch, and he commanded this honor guard detachment with the rigid authority of an officer who had built his career on ceremonies rather than combat. He had seen the homeless man speak to his soldier. He had seen his soldier nod in response. And now he was moving toward the rope line, with 2 military police officers following in his wake. His face set in an expression that promised consequences for whatever had just occurred. Vernon did not see him coming. His eyes were still on the formation, still watching the young soldier execute each movement with the precision that ceremony demanded. He was thinking about Marcus Webb, about the last time he had stood in formation with his best friend, about the weight of the rifle and the weight of the flag and the weight of everything that came after. He was thinking about Margaret, about the 51 years they had shared, about the morning she had not woken up and the silence that had swallowed his life whole. He did not see Captain Bosch until the man's shadow fell across him like a blade. "Sir," Bosch said, and the word carried no respect despite its form. "You need to step away from the rope line. This is a restricted ceremony." Vernon turned slowly, his movements unhurried despite the authority radiating from the officer before him. He saw the captain's insignia, the ceremonial uniform, the 2 MPs positioned just behind like weapons waiting to be drawn. He saw the contempt in Bosch's eyes as they scanned Vernon's threadbare jacket, his cracked boots, his weathered face that carried the map of 7 decades and 4 years of sleeping under bridges. "I meant no disrespect," Vernon said, his voice quiet but steady. "I only offered a small correction." The boy's timing was off. Bosch's expression hardened into something that looked almost like satisfaction. "A correction," he repeated, loud enough that nearby families turned to watch. "You offer my soldiers a correction. And what exactly qualifies you to correct honor guard drills, sir?" The question hung in the cold November air. 2,000 people had come to honor the dead, and now a growing number of them were watching a different kind of ceremony unfold, one that had nothing to do with rifles and flags, and everything to do with the cruelty that lived in the gap between appearance and truth. Vernon Tate stood in that gap, surrounded by the graves of brothers he had sworn to honor, and said nothing at all. What Captain Raymond Bosch did not know, what he could not have known from looking at the homeless man before him, was that in exactly 7 minutes, his entire understanding of service and sacrifice would be dismantled by a single word spoken by a woman who had earned the right to speak it. The silence stretched between Vernon and the captain like a wire pulled to breaking. Around them, the ceremony continued, the chaplain's voice carrying across the headstones in measured cadences of grief and gratitude, but the families nearest the rope line had stopped listening. Their attention had shifted to the confrontation unfolding before them, to the homeless man in the threadbare jacket and the officer whose contempt radiated from him like heat from a fire. Vernon could feel the weight of their eyes. He had felt that weight before, in courtrooms where judges looked at him like something scraped from the bottom of a shoe, in shelters where volunteers smiled with pity that cut deeper than any blade, in the faces of strangers who crossed the street to avoid walking too close to what he had become. He had learned to carry that weight in silence, to let it press down on him without bending, to remember that he had carried heavier things in places where the weight of judgment was nothing compared to the weight of a brother's body. Captain Bosch stepped closer, close enough that Vernon could smell the starch in his uniform and the aftershave that probably cost more than Vernon had eaten in a month. The captain's voice dropped to something meant to sound reasonable, but Vernon recognized the tone. It was the voice of authority preparing to crush something small. "I'm going to ask you one more time," Bosch said. "Step away from the rope line and remove yourself from this ceremony. This is sacred ground, and you are disrupting proceedings that honor men and women who actually served." Vernon's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The words "actually served" landed like a slap, deliberate and precise in their cruelty. He had heard variations of this accusation before, from police officers who found him sleeping in doorways, from security guards who chased him from public spaces, from well-dressed citizens who assumed that homelessness and stolen valor walked hand in hand. He had never defended himself against these accusations. He had learned long ago that defense invited escalation, that silence was armor, that the truth of who he had been mattered less than the reality of what he had become. But something in this place, surrounded by the graves of brothers whose names he still whispered in his sleep, made the silence harder to maintain. "I serve," he said quietly. "3rd Infantry Regiment, the Old Guard." Bosch's expression shifted from contempt to something that looked almost like amusement. He turned slightly, ensuring that his voice would carry to the growing audience of families and veterans who had gathered near the rope line. "The Old Guard," he repeated, letting the words hang in the air like an accusation. "Of course you did. Let me guess what comes next. You guarded the tomb of the unknown soldier. You were special. You were one of the elite." 15 years, Vernon said. His voice did not rise to match Bosch's theatrical volume. It remained low, steady, carrying the weight of truth that needed no amplification. The captain laughed. The sound was sharp and ugly against the sacred quiet of the cemetery, and several families visibly flinched at its intrusion. 15 years at the tomb. That is quite a claim. Do you have any idea how competitive those positions are? Do you have any idea how many men wash out of tomb guard training every year? And you expect me to believe that a man who looks like you, who smells like you, who clearly has not held a steady job in years, stood sentinel at the most sacred post in the American military for 15 years. Vernon said nothing. He was not looking at Bosch anymore. His eyes had drifted past the captain, past the ceremony, past the rows of white headstones that stretched toward the horizon. He was looking at something only he could see, a memory that lived behind his eyes like a photograph that never faded. He was 24 years old, and the weight of the M14 rifle in his hands was exactly 14 pounds and 3 ounces. He knew this because he had weighed it himself, had memorized every specification, had learned the weapon so completely that it had become an extension of his body rather than a tool held in his hands. The marble beneath his boots was cold despite the August heat, cold in a way that seemed to rise from the bones of the unknown soldiers who lay beneath it, and he could feel that cold climbing through his legs as he stood his post. 21 steps. He counted each one in his head, his pace exactly 90 steps per minute, his rifle held at the precise angle specified in regulations he had memorized until the words lived in his muscles rather than his mind. 21 seconds. He paused at the end of his walk, facing the tomb, feeling the weight of every eye that watched from the amphitheater above, feeling the weight of the dead who had entrusted their memory to his keeping. The turn. He executed it with the precision of a machine, but he was not a machine. He was a man who had chosen to become something more than himself, who had surrendered his individual identity to serve as a symbol of national grief and gratitude. He had stood that post in rain that soaked through his uniform in seconds. He had stood it in snow that accumulated on his shoulders until tourists gasped and pointed. He had stood it in heat that made lesser men collapse, in cold that turned his fingers white inside his gloves, in hurricanes that the army finally ordered him inside to escape. He had stood it at 3 in the morning when no one watched, when the only witnesses were the dead themselves, when the only sound was the rhythm of his own breathing and the whisper of wind across the marble. For 15 years, he had been the sentinel. He had earned the badge that fewer than 700 soldiers in history had ever worn. He had trained the men who now stood that post, had written the annotations in the drill manual that standardized movements which had been passed down through generations of guardians, had given his life to the service of the dead until there was nothing left of him that existed apart from that service. And then Margaret had died, and the structure that held him together had collapsed like a building with its foundation removed, and he had walked away from everything because standing still had become impossible. The memory released him, and he was back in the November cold, back in the threadbare jacket, back in the body of a 70-year-old man who had not slept in a bed for 4 years. Captain Bosch was still talking, his voice carrying across the ceremonial ground in tones of righteous indignation. But Vernon had stopped listening to the words. He was watching the young soldier he had corrected, watching Private First Class Carter execute each movement with the precision that Vernon had helped him find, and in that precision Vernon saw something that looked almost like hope. The boy was good. The boy would be better. The boy would stand his own posts and carry his own weights and learn that ceremony was not performance but prayer. And perhaps, decades from now, the boy would find himself standing at a rope line, watching a young soldier struggle with the same timing error, and he would lean forward and whisper the same correction that Vernon had whispered today. The chain would continue. The dead would be honored. The precision would be passed down like a sacred inheritance from one generation to the next. That was enough. That had to be enough. Bosch's voice cut through Vernon's reverie like a blade. I asked you a question. Are you going to answer me, or are you going to stand there like the vagrant you obviously are? Vernon blinked, refocusing on the captain's face. The contempt there had deepened, had hardened into something that looked almost like hatred. Vernon recognized that hatred. It was the hatred of a man who had built his identity on the symbols of service without understanding what service actually cost, who wore the uniform like a costume rather than a covenant, who saw in Vernon's threadbare appearance a threat to everything he believed about what soldiers were supposed to look like. What do you want me to say? Vernon asked. His voice remained quiet, but something in its tone made Bosch hesitate for just a moment. I told you who I am. I told you where I served. If you choose not to believe me, that is your choice. But I'm not going to stand here and defend my service to a man who has never asked himself what that service costs. The words landed like a blow. Bosch's face flushed red, and his hand shot out to grip Vernon's arm, hard enough to bruise, hard enough to make Vernon's worn jacket ride up toward his elbow. The captain pulled Vernon toward him, close enough that their faces were inches apart, close enough that Vernon could see the rage trembling in the younger man's jaw. You want to talk about cost? Bosch said, his voice a harsh whisper. You want to lecture me about service? Let me tell you something about service. Service is showing up every day in a pressed uniform. Service is maintaining standards. Service is not letting men like you disgrace the memory of real veterans by claiming honors you never earned. Vernon did not pull away. He stood in the captain's grip like a stone in a river, letting the current of rage flow around him without moving him from his place. His eyes met Bosch's, and in them there was something that made the captain's grip falter for just a moment. "Service," Vernon said, "is holding your best friend while he bleeds out in your arms. Service is carrying his body 2 kilometers through enemy fire because you will not leave him behind. Service is standing at a marble tomb for 15 years because the dead deserve someone who will not abandon them. And Service is walking away from everything you loved because staying would have meant destroying what little was left of you." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that seemed to press down on everything within earshot. "You want to know what service costs, Captain? It costs everything, and the receipt is written on your soul in ink that never fades." The captain's grip on Vernon's arm tightened, fingers digging into flesh that had grown thin from years of irregular meals and nights spent sleeping on concrete. The pain was distant, almost abstract, filtered through decades of learning to separate the body's complaints from the mind's purpose. Vernon had endured worse. He had endured shrapnel tearing through his shoulder in a schoolyard in Panama City. He had endured the cold of January nights at the tomb, when the wind cut through his uniform like knives made of ice. He had endured the slow suffocation of watching Margaret's breath grow shallow in a hospice bed, while machines beeped their indifferent countdown to silence. This was nothing. This man's anger was nothing. But the crowd around them did not see nothing. They saw an officer in ceremonial dress gripping a homeless veteran hard enough to leave bruises, and the phones had begun to emerge from pockets and purses like flowers blooming toward an unexpected son. Elena Marchetti, 67 years old, her son's name about to be read in the honor roll of the fallen, held her phone with hands that trembled but did not waver. She had buried her child. She had learned what courage looked like when it wore the face of grief. And she recognized something in the old man's stillness that reminded her of her son in the last photograph he had ever sent home, standing in the Afghan dust with eyes that had seen things no mother should have to imagine. She pressed record and did not look away. Captain Bosch seemed oblivious to the phones, or perhaps he simply did not care. His world had narrowed to the man before him, to the challenge that Vernon's quiet words represented, to the desperate need to reassert an authority that felt suddenly fragile. He released Vernon's arm with a shove that sent the older man stumbling back a half step, and his voice rose to a volume that carried across the ceremonial ground like a declaration of war. "You want to talk about holding men while they die," he said. "You want to lecture me about sacrifice. Every stolen valor case I have ever seen uses the same script. Dead friends, heroic actions, medals that conveniently cannot be verified. You people disgust me. You take the real suffering of real veterans and you wear it like a costume to get sympathy and handouts." Vernon steadied himself, his boots finding purchase on the frost-covered grass. The shove had caused his jacket sleeve to ride up further, exposing more of his forearm to the cold November air, but he did not move to adjust it. His eyes remained fixed on Bosch's face, watching the captain the way a man watches a storm approaching across an open field. There was nothing to do but stand and let it pass. The families nearest the rope line had stopped pretending to watch the ceremony. Their attention was fixed entirely on the confrontation, their faces reflecting a spectrum of emotions that ranged from discomfort to outrage to something that looked almost like recognition. Among them stood veterans whose own service had taught them to read the signs that civilians missed, the subtle indicators of training that no amount of hardship could fully erase. They saw Vernon's posture, the way his weight distributed automatically into a stable stance despite his age. They saw his hands, still and controlled at his sides when a civilian would have been gesturing or defensive. They saw his breathing, slow and measured, the breathing of a man who had learned to control his body's responses in situations far more dangerous than this. One of them, a Korean War veteran in his late 80s, leaned toward his grandson and whispered something that made the younger man's eyes widen. Bosch was still talking, his voice growing louder with each sentence, his accusations becoming more specific and more cruel. He questioned Vernon's mental stability. He suggested that whatever service Vernon might have actually rendered was probably limited to peeling potatoes in some stateside mess hall. He implied that Vernon's homelessness was evidence of a fundamental character flaw, a weakness that real soldiers would never allow themselves to fall into. Each word was a small violence, a deliberate attempt to strip away whatever dignity Vernon had managed to preserve through 4 years of sleeping under bridges and eating from soup kitchens. Vernon absorbed it all without visible reaction. He had learned this stillness at the tomb, where sentinels were forbidden to acknowledge the tourists who sometimes tried to make them flinch or smile or break their concentration. He had perfected it in the years after Margaret's death, when the alternative to stillness was a kind of screaming that he feared would never stop once it started. He stood in Captain Bosch's fury like a rock in a river, letting the current crash against him without moving from his place. But the crowd was moving. The crowd was shifting and murmuring and exchanging glances that carried meaning Vernon could not see. And somewhere in that crowd, a woman was pushing her way toward the front with a purpose that had nothing to do with curiosity and everything to do with recognition. Command Sergeant Major Lucille Pryor had spent her career in the Army learning to read situations the way other people read books. She had served in Iraq and Afghanistan, had led soldiers through firefights and IED strikes, had earned her rank through competence and courage in equal measure. But her proudest assignment had been her 3 years as Sergeant of the Guard at the tomb of the unknown soldier, 3 years during which she had walked the same marble that Vernon had walked, had carried the same weight that Vernon had carried, had learned the same truth that Vernon had learned about what it meant to serve the dead. She had been standing near the VIP section when the commotion began, her attention split between the ceremony and the growing disturbance near the rope line. At first she had assumed it was the usual conflict, some well-meaning civilian who had stepped too close or spoken too loudly in a place that demanded reverence. But as she moved closer, as the captain's voice grew louder and the accusations grew more specific, something in the old man's stillness had caught her attention. She knew that stillness. She had trained to achieve it herself, had spent months learning to stand motionless for hours regardless of weather or distraction or pain. It was not the stillness of submission or fear. It was the stillness of the sentinel, the absolute control that came from surrendering the self to something larger. She pushed through the crowd, her eyes fixed on the old man's posture, on his hands, on the way he held himself despite the captain's assault. She was close enough now to see details that distance had obscured. She saw the threadbare field jacket with its insignia removed, but its cut unmistakably military. She saw the boots, cracked and worn, but polished with a care that spoke of habits too deep to break. She saw the forearm that the shove had exposed, the skin weathered and thin, but marked with ink that made her breath catch in her throat. The tattoo was faded, but unmistakable. The Tomb Guard badge, the crossed rifles and wreath that fewer than 700 soldiers in history had earned the right to wear permanently on their skin. Below it, dates that spanned 15 years of service. And below that, in script so small she had to squint to read it, for words that had been the unofficial motto of every sentinel who had ever walked the marble. Silence and respect. Pryor stopped moving. Her heart was hammering against her ribs in a way it had not hammered since her last firefight in Kandahar. She knew what she was looking at. She knew who she was looking at. Not the specific identity, not yet, but the category of man, the type of soldier, the weight of service that no amount of homelessness could erase. She had seen photographs at Old Guard headquarters, black and white images from decades past showing the sentinels who had walked before her. She had studied the drill manual with its handwritten annotations, corrections, and refinements that had been passed down through generations of guardians. She had heard the stories whispered by senior NCOs about the men who had shaped the tradition she inherited, the legends who had set the standards that she and every sentinel after her struggled to maintain. And now, standing in the November cold, watching Captain Bosch heap abuse on a homeless man who absorbed it with the stillness of marble, she felt a terrible suspicion crystallize into something approaching certainty. She spoke before she could stop herself, her voice cutting through Bosch's tirade like a rifle shot through silence. Captain. The single word carried an authority that had nothing to do with her civilian clothes and everything to do with the decades of service that had earned her the right to speak it. Bosch turned, his face flushed with interrupted rage, his mouth already forming a dismissal of whoever had dared to interrupt him. But Pryor was not looking at the captain. Her eyes were fixed on Vernon's forearm, on the faded ink that told a story no stolen valor case had ever successfully fabricated. She knew. She did not yet know his name or his specific history or the exact nature of his service. But she knew what that tattoo meant. She knew what that stillness cost. And she knew that whatever Captain Bosch thought he was doing, he was about to discover that some mistakes cannot be unmade. Sentinel, she said, and the word hung in the cold air like a prayer. The word sentinel moved through the crowd like a ripple across still water, passing from those who understood its weight to those who sensed that weight without comprehension. Veterans straightened almost imperceptibly, their bodies responding to the title before their minds could catch up. Civilians glanced at each other with questions in their eyes, uncertain why a single word had changed the temperature of the November morning. Vernon heard it. He had not heard that word spoken aloud in reference to himself in nearly 5 years, not since the last time he had visited the tomb before Margaret's decline had consumed everything else. The sound of it struck something deep in his chest, a resonance that vibrated through bones and memory alike. And for a moment, he was not a 70-year-old homeless man standing in the cold. He was the guardian of the unknown dead, the keeper of the eternal flame, the soldier who had sworn an oath that transcended rank and regulation and even the boundaries of his own life. He turned toward the voice, and his eyes found Lucille Pryor standing at the edge of the crowd with tears beginning to form at the corners of her eyes. Captain Bosch turned as well, his face contorted with the frustration of interrupted authority. "Who are you?" he demanded. "This is an official ceremony, and you are interfering with the removal of a trespasser." Pryor did not acknowledge him. Her focus remained fixed on Vernon, on the tattoo that marked his forearm, on the stillness that she recognized because she had spent 3 years of her life learning to achieve it herself. She took a step forward, then another, moving past the rope line that separated spectators from sacred ground, moving toward Vernon with the deliberate pace of someone approaching a shrine. "What is your name?" she asked, and her voice carried the tremor of someone who already suspected the answer. Vernon met her eyes. He saw in them the recognition that he had stopped hoping anyone would ever show him again, the understanding that came only from shared experience, the respect that was not given freely but earned through sacrifice. He saw a fellow sentinel, a woman who had walked the same marble and carried the same weight and learned the same truth about what it meant to serve something larger than yourself. "Vernon Tate," he said, "Sergeant First Class, retired." The name struck Pryor like a physical blow. Her hand rose involuntarily to her mouth, and the tears that had been forming spilled down her cheeks in silver tracks that caught the pale morning light. She had heard that name before. Every sentinel heard that name at some point during their training, usually whispered by senior NCOs in tones of reverence that bordered on awe. Vernon Tate, who had served 15 years at the tomb when most sentinels served 3. Vernon Tate, who had written the ceremonial drill annotations that every honor guard soldier trained from. Vernon Tate, who had earned the Silver Star in Panama, and then returned to the tomb as if combat heroism was simply another duty to be performed with precision and humility. Vernon Tate, who had disappeared from the veteran community 5 years ago and whom no one had been able to find since. "Oh God," Pryor breathed. The words were not blasphemy, but prayer, an invocation of whatever power might be listening to witness what was unfolding on this sacred ground. She turned to Bosch, and her voice hardened into something that sounded like a blade being drawn from its sheath. "Captain, do you have any idea who this man is?" Bosch's face had begun to shift, the certainty of his contempt giving way to something that looked almost like unease. He glanced between Pryor and Vernon, between the tears on her face and the stillness on his, and for the first time since the confrontation began, doubt flickered in his eyes. "I know what I see," he said, but his voice had lost some of its theatrical volume. "I see a homeless man who claims to have served at the tomb. I see another stolen valor case try to exploit the sympathy of Real veterans. Pryor shook her head slowly, the gesture carrying a weight of disbelief that seemed to press down on everyone watching. You see a man in worn clothes, and you assume you know his story. You see poverty, and you assume weakness. You see age, and you assume irrelevance. She stepped closer to Bosch, close enough that her words would not carry beyond the three of them. I served as sergeant of the guard at the tomb from 2008 to 2011. I walked the same marble this man walked. I studied the same manual this man annotated with his own hands. And I am telling you, Captain, that you have just publicly humiliated one of the most decorated ceremonial soldiers in the history of the United States Army. The color drained from Bosch's face. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. He looked at Vernon with new eyes, eyes that were beginning to see past the threadbare jacket and cracked boots to something that his contempt had made invisible. But the damage was already done. The phones that had been recording captured everything. Elena Marchetti's steady hand had documented each accusation, each shove, each moment of cruelty that Bosch had delivered with such theatrical confidence. The crowd that had gathered was no longer a passive audience, but a chorus of witnesses, their faces reflecting the shift from uncomfortable observation to dawning outrage. Vernon watched the captain's composure crumble, and he felt nothing that resembled satisfaction. He had not wanted this. He had not wanted to be recognized or vindicated or restored to any position of honor. He had wanted only to watch the ceremony, to stand among the graves of his brothers, to whisper the names of the dead in the silence of his own heart. He had wanted to correct a young soldier's timing, because precision mattered, because the dead deserved perfection, because some part of him would always be the sentinel regardless of what he had become. The memories pressed against his consciousness like water against a dam, seeking any crack through which they might flood. He was back in Panama, December of 1989, the air thick with smoke and the sound of gunfire and the screams of civilians who had never asked to be caught in the crossfire of history. He was crouched behind a school bus, his rifle hot in his hands, watching Marcus Webb move toward the building where 37 American teachers and their families huddled in terror. Marcus had been his brother in everything but blood. They had enlisted together, trained together, earned their places in the old guard together. They had stood sentinel duty on opposite shifts, passing each other in the quiet hours of the night with nods that carried entire conversations. They had promised each other that they would survive whatever came, that they would grow old together telling stories about the things they had seen and done, that their children would play together on summer evenings while their wives exchanged recipes and complaints about husbands who could never quite leave the army behind. But Panama had broken that promise the way war breaks all promises, with sudden violence and blood that would not stop flowing no matter how hard Vernon pressed his hands against the wounds. He saw Marcus turn toward him, saw the muzzle flash from the window they had cleared twice, saw his brother's body jerk with the impact of rounds that should have found Vernon instead. He was moving before conscious thought could form, crossing the open ground with a speed that seemed to belong to someone younger and faster and more desperate than he had ever been. He caught Marcus as he fell, lowered him to the ground, pressed his hands against the holes of his chest while blood pumped between his fingers in rhythms that grew weaker with each heartbeat. Marcus looked up at him with eyes that were already beginning to dim. His lips moved, forming words that Vernon would carry for the rest of his life. "You got them out. That is what matters." And then he was gone, and Vernon was alone in the chaos with his brother's blood cooling on his hands and 37 civilians depending on him to finish what Marcus had started. He had finished it. He had carried Marcus's body 2 kilometers through hostile territory to the extraction point because leaving him behind was not something Vernon's soul could survive. He had received the Silver Star for his actions that day, had stood in dress uniform while generals pinned medals to his chest, had accepted the gratitude of a nation that would never understand what the gratitude had cost him. And then he had returned to the tomb, because the dead needed someone to guard them, and guarding the dead was the only thing Vernon knew how to do. The memory released him, and he was back in the November cold, back in the cemetery, back in the body of a man who had outlived everyone he had ever loved. Pryor was still speaking to Bosch, her voice low and urgent, explaining things that Vernon could not hear clearly through the ringing in his ears. The crowd was still watching, their phones still recording, their faces still reflecting the drama that Vernon had never wanted to be part of. He looked down at his hands, at the weathered skin and prominent veins, at the fingers that had once held rifles with perfect precision and had pressed against wounds that would not stop bleeding. These hands had served. These hands had failed. These hands had carried weight that no medal could measure and no ceremony could honor. And now these hands hung empty at his sides while strangers decided what his story meant. The ceremony had stopped, not officially, not by any announcement or command, but the weight of what was unfolding near the rope line had pulled the attention of everyone present away from the scripted proceedings and towards something that felt far more real. The chaplain stood at the podium with his prepared remarks forgotten in his hands. The honor guard detail had completed their drill sequence, but remained in formation, uncertain whether to continue or wait for guidance that was not coming. Even the wind seemed to have stilled, as if the November morning itself was holding its breath. Captain Bosch stood frozen in the space between his crumbling certainty and the terrible recognition of what he had done. His face had gone pale beneath the flush of his earlier anger, and his hands, which had gripped Vernon's arm with such confident cruelty just minutes ago, now hung at his sides like tools whose purpose he had forgotten. He looked at Vernon with eyes that were finally beginning to see, but seeing came too late to undo what had already been recorded on dozens of phones. Command Sergeant Major Pryor had not finished. She stood between Vernon and the captain like a shield made of rank and recognition, her voice carrying across the sacred ground with an authority that transcended her civilian clothes. This man served 15 years as a sentinel at the tomb of the unknown soldier, she said, and her words were not directed at Bosch alone, but at everyone within earshot. 15 years, Captain. Do you understand what that means? Most sentinels serve one tour. 3 years at most. This man gave 15 years of his life to guarding the unknown dead, walking the same 21 steps in every kind of weather, maintaining the same perfect standards day after day and year after year, while you were probably still learning to tie your shoes. Bosch flinched at the words, but did not respond. There was nothing he could say that would not make things worse, and some part of him had finally recognized that truth. Pryor continued, her voice rising with each sentence. He wrote the ceremonial drill annotations that your honor guard trains from. Every movement your soldiers make, every count and breath and position was refined and codified by the man you just shoved and accused of stolen valor. The manual you claimed to uphold was shaped by his hands, and you stood here in front of 2,000 people and called him a disgrace. The crowd had grown larger as word spread through the cemetery. Veterans who had been visiting graves in distant sections had made their way toward the commotion, drawn by the tone of voices and the gathering of phones. Among them moved Lieutenant General Franklin Hayes, retired, his civilian overcoat doing little to disguise the bearing of a man who had commanded armies. He had been laying flowers at the grave of his own father, a World War II veteran who had died peacefully in his sleep 20 years ago, when the shift in the ceremony's atmosphere had pulled him toward the rope line. He pushed through the crowd with the easy authority of someone accustomed to crowds parting before him. His eyes scanned the scene, taking in the pale-faced captain, the weeping woman in civilian clothes, the gathered witnesses with their phones raised like weapons. And then his gaze found Vernon, and recognition struck him with the force of a physical blow. Hayes had signed Vernon's retirement orders in 1993. He had been a colonel then, serving as commander of the Old Guard, responsible for every ceremonial unit at Arlington and the tomb. He had known Vernon Tate as one of the finest soldiers ever to serve under his command, a man whose dedication to the Sentinel mission had bordered on the sacred. He had watched Vernon receive the Silver Star for Panama, had read the after-action reports that detailed heroism most soldiers could not imagine, had understood that Vernon's return to the tomb after combat was not a retreat from war, but an embrace of a different kind of service. And now he stood watching that same man, aged and weathered and dressed in clothes that spoke of poverty and loss, absorbing the abuse of an officer who did not deserve to polish Vernon's boots. Vernon. The general's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd like a command given on a battlefield. Vernon Tate. Vernon turned at the sound of his name, spoken in a voice he had not heard in decades. His eyes found Hayes, and for a moment the two men simply looked at each other across the gap of years and circumstance. The general saw the boy he had known, the sentinel who had embodied everything the tomb guard was supposed to represent, buried beneath layers of age and hardship. Vernon saw the colonel who had believed in him, who had written recommendations that glowed with praise, who had understood without being told what the service had cost. "General Hayes," Vernon said, and his voice cracked on the words. "Sir." Hayes moved forward, ignoring the rope line, ignoring protocol, ignoring everything except the need to reach the man who stood alone amid the gathering storm. He stopped directly in front of Vernon and extended his hand, not in the casual grip of civilian greeting, but in the formal clasp of one soldier acknowledging another. "Sergeant First Class Vernon Tate," Hayes said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I signed your retirement orders 32 years ago. You were the finest sentinel I ever had the privilege to command." He paused, his eyes sweeping across the crowd before returning to Vernon's face. "And you were a Silver Star recipient for actions in Panama that saved 37 American lives at the cost of watching your best friend die in your arms." The words fell into a silence, so complete that Vernon could hear his own heartbeat. Around him, the crowd had stopped moving, stopped whispering, stopped doing anything except absorbing the weight of what the general had just said. Phones that had been recording lowered slightly as their holders forgot they were supposed to be documenting and simply listened. Bosch made a sound that might have been a word, but emerged as something closer to a whimper. His face had gone from pale to gray, the color of a man watching his career disintegrate in real time. He looked at Vernon with eyes that held the beginning of understanding, the first terrible recognition of exactly what he had done and who he had done it to. But Vernon was not looking at Bosch. He was looking at General Hayes, at the hand that still clasped his own, at the face of a man who had known him when he was still whole. The contact was overwhelming, the first touch of genuine respect he had felt in years, and something inside him that had been frozen for a very long time began to crack. "I lost her," he said, and the words came out broken, fragments of a grief he had never spoken aloud. "Margaret, 5 years ago. She was everything that held me together, and when she was gone I could not find a reason to stay. So I walked. I walked until I could not remember why I had stopped." Hayes did not release his grip. His eyes glistened with moisture that a general was not supposed to show, but he had stopped being a general years ago. Now he was simply a man who understood loss, who had buried his own wife 3 years past, who knew the weight of grief that Vernon carried. "I know," Hayes said quietly. "I know what it costs. But you are still here, Vernon. You are still standing. And that matters more than you understand." The crowd watched in silence as two old soldiers held each other's hands amid the graves of the fallen, their shared grief a bridge across decades of separation. The ceremony had been forgotten. The confrontation had been forgotten. There was only this moment, this recognition, this acknowledgement of service and sacrifice that transcended rank and circumstance. And somewhere in the crowd, Elena Marchetti continued to record, her phone capturing not cruelty now, but something that looked almost like redemption beginning to take shape. The silence that followed General Hayes's words seemed to have its own weight, pressing down on the gathered crowd like a physical force. 2,000 people who had come to honor the dead now stood witness to something that felt like resurrection, the emergence of a man they had dismissed as broken from the shadows of their own assumptions. The November wind stirred again, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and turned earth, carrying the whispered conversations of those who were beginning to understand what they were seeing. Private First Class Deshaun Carter had not moved from his position in the honor guard formation. His rifle remained at his side, his posture remained rigid, but his eyes had not left Vernon since the moment Command Sergeant Major Pryor had spoken the word sentinel. He was 19 years old, 6 months into his first assignment with the ceremonial unit, still learning the weight of what it meant to carry a rifle in service of the dead. And now he understood that the homeless man who had corrected his timing, who had offered guidance with such quiet precision, was not some deluded vagrant playing soldier. He was the source, He was the origin point of everything Carter had been taught. The young soldier's throat tightened with emotion he had not expected to feel. He thought about the hours he had spent practicing the movements that Vernon had codified, the frustration of failing to achieve the precision that the manual demanded, the pride he had felt when he finally executed a sequence without error. All of that work, all of that struggle, all of that dedication traced back to the man standing in the worn field jacket with tears now streaming down his weathered face. Carter wanted to break formation. He wanted to cross the ceremonial ground and thank Vernon for the correction that had made his movements perfect. He wanted to apologize for the captain's cruelty, for the system that had allowed a legend to fall through every crack, for the blindness that had made them all complicit in Vernon's suffering. But he was a soldier, and soldiers held their positions until ordered otherwise, so he stood and watched and felt his understanding of service reshape itself around what he was witnessing. General Hayes had finally released Vernon's hand, but he had not stepped back. He stood beside the older man like a guardian, his presence a silent declaration that anyone who wished to cause further harm would have to go through him first. His eyes swept across the crowd, taking in the phones that had captured everything, the faces that reflected shock and shame and dawning recognition. "This ceremony will resume," Hayes said, and his voice carried the authority of decades of command. "But it will resume with Sergeant First Class Tate seated in a position of honor." He turned to look at Bosch, and his expression hardened into something that made the captain take an involuntary step backward. "Captain, you and I will have a conversation after these proceedings conclude. A very thorough conversation." Bosch's mouth opened, perhaps to offer defense or excuse, but no words emerged. He stood frozen in the wreckage of his own arrogance, surrounded by witnesses who had recorded every moment of his cruelty, facing a general whose displeasure could end careers with a single phone call. The confident officer who had demanded Vernon's removal 20 minutes ago had been replaced by something smaller, something diminished, something that understood for the first time what it felt like to be judged by appearance and found wanting. "Sir," Bosch finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper, "I did not know. I could not have known." Hayes regarded him with eyes that held no mercy. "That is precisely the point, Captain. You could not have known, so you should not have assumed. You saw a man in worn clothes, and you decided you understood his entire story. You saw poverty, and you translated it into weakness. You saw age, and you dismissed everything that age might have accumulated." He paused, letting the words settle into the silence. "Every veteran you encounter on these streets, every man or woman who looks broken by circumstances you cannot see, might be carrying a weight you will never understand. That is the lesson you should have learned before you ever put on that uniform." Vernon listened to the general's words, but his attention had drifted elsewhere. He was watching the honor guard formation, watching the young soldiers who stood at rigid attention while their commander was dismantled before them. He saw their youth, their dedication, their desperate desire to serve with distinction. He saw himself in them. The boy he had been 50 years ago when he first learned that ceremony was not performance but prayer. And he saw the young private whose timing he had corrected, the boy whose eyes had widened to Vernon's whispered guidance, the soldier who had trusted a stranger's words and adjusted his breathing and transformed an almost perfect movement into something flawless. That boy would remember this day. That boy would carry this moment forward into a career that might span decades. That boy would become the kind of soldier who looked past appearances to see the truth beneath, who offered respect as a default rather than a reward, who understood that the uniform was not the measure of the man. That was worth something. That had to be worth something. Vernon stepped forward, away from the general's protective presence, and the crowd shifted with a collective intake of breath. He moved slowly, his cracked boots leaving prints in the frost-covered grass, his threadbare jacket hanging loose on a frame that had grown thin from years of irregular meals. He moved past Captain Bosch without acknowledgement, past the rope line that had separated him from sacred ground, past all the barriers that society had erected between what he had been and what he had become. He stopped in front of the honor guard formation. 8 young soldiers looked at him with eyes that held a mixture of awe and uncertainty. their training telling them to maintain position, while something deeper urged them to respond to the man who had shaped the very movements they performed. Vernon's gaze found Private Carter. The boy was trembling slightly, the effort of maintaining his rigid posture visible in the tension of his jaw and the brightness of his eyes. Vernon understood that trembling. He had felt it himself decades ago, when the weight of the tomb had first pressed down on his young shoulders. "Your breathing was perfect," Vernon said, his voice quiet but carrying in the morning stillness. "Your third count was flawless." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had gained a resonance that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his chest. "You honored them. Never forget that this is what we do. We honor them with our precision because they gave everything, and precision is the least we can offer in return." Carter's composure cracked. A single tear escaped his rigid expression and traced a line down his cheek, but he did not move to wipe it away. He held his position as he had been trained to do, but his voice emerged in a whisper that Vernon alone could hear. "Thank you, Sergeant." Vernon nodded once, the gesture carrying the weight of acknowledgement between generations of soldiers who understood what it meant to serve. Then he turned and walked back toward General Hayes, back toward the crowd that parted before him like water before a ship's prow, back toward whatever came next. The ceremony would resume. The names would be read. The rifles would crack their salute to the fallen. But something had changed in the space between the white headstones, something that could not be unchanged no matter how the day concluded. A legend had emerged from the shadows. A truth had been spoken that could not be unspoken. And somewhere in the crowd, Elena Marchetti saved her recording and began composing the post that would carry Vernon's story to millions who had never heard his name. The ceremony resumed with Vernon seated in the front row beside General Hayes, a folding chair produced from somewhere and placed on ground that protocol normally reserved for dignitaries and Gold Star families. He sat with the stillness that had defined his service, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the proceedings with an attention that missed nothing. Around him, the atmosphere had transformed from solemn remembrance into something charged with additional meaning. The weight of what had just occurred layering itself atop the weight of all the names about to be read. The chaplain returned to the podium, his voice steadier now, but carrying a new depth that had not been there before. He spoke of sacrifice not as an abstraction, but as something living, something that walked among them in worn boots and threadbare jackets, something that persisted long after the uniforms were put away and the medals were stored in drawers that no one opened anymore. His words found Vernon without naming him, honoring the man through implication while the crowd listened with an attention that had been sharpened by witness. Vernon heard the words, but his mind had traveled elsewhere. He was thinking about Margaret, about the morning she had died with her hand in his, her breathing growing shallow until it simply stopped, and the silence that followed was the loudest thing he had ever heard. He was thinking about the days after, the terrible emptiness of a house that had been built for two, the way her absence filled every room more completely than her presence ever had. He was thinking about the moment he had decided to leave, to walk away from everything they had built together, because staying meant drowning in a grief that had no bottom. He had told himself he was protecting their memory by leaving. He had told himself that his presence would only tarnish what they had been, that his brokenness would spread like a stain across everything Margaret had loved. He had told himself lies that made the leaving easier, and then he had walked until the lies became a kind of truth, and the man he had been disappeared into the man he had become. But sitting here now, surrounded by the graves of soldiers who had given everything, Vernon wondered if the leaving had been cowardice disguised as sacrifice. He wondered if Margaret would have wanted him to vanish into the shadows, to surrender the life they had built, to become a ghost haunting the margins of a world that had once welcomed him. He wondered if his service to the dead had become an excuse to stop serving the living, including himself. The honor roll began, names read aloud in measured cadences, each one representing a life cut short by the demands of duty. Families stood as their loved ones were called, tears streaming down faces that held grief and pride in equal measure. The crowd responded to each name with silence that was itself a form of speech, an acknowledgement that these syllables represented something beyond language. Elena Marchetti stood when her son's name was read. Michael Anthony Marchetti, Sergeant, United States Army, killed in action, Kandahar Province, Afghanistan. She stood alone because her husband had died of a heart attack 2 years after Michael, because grief had a way of claiming more than its initial victims, because she had learned that loss rarely stopped at the first blow. She stood with her phone in her pocket now, the recording saved, her attention given entirely to the moment of recognition that her son deserved. Vernon watched her stand. He did not know her story, did not know the specific weight she carried, but he recognized the way she held herself, the rigid posture that was not military training, but the desperate attempt to keep from collapsing under the pressure of what she had lost. He had worn that same posture in the days after Marcus died, in the years after Margaret followed. He wore it still, bones and will locked together against the gravity of grief. Their eyes met across the rows of folding chairs. Elena saw the homeless veteran who had been publicly humiliated and then spectacularly vindicated. Vernon saw a mother who had buried her child and somehow continued to breathe. Between them passed an understanding that required no words, the silent communion of people who had learned that loss was not something you recovered from, but something you learned to carry. Elena nodded once, a small gesture that carried enormous weight. Vernon nodded in return, and then she sat down as the next name was called, and the ceremony continued its march through the alphabet of sacrifice. The rifles cracked their salute as the honor roll concluded. 8M1 Garands firing in perfect unison, the sound splitting the November air and echoing off the white headstones that stood in silent witness. Vernon's hands did not twitch this time. Private Carter's timing was flawless, his breathing synchronized with his movement, his count precise to the fraction of a second. The correction had taken root. The chain of knowledge had extended by one more link. Taps began to play. The mournful notes carried by a lone bugler standing on a small rise overlooking the ceremony. The melody that had signaled the end of day for soldiers since the Civil War now signaled the end of this gathering, the final acknowledgement of lives given in service. Vernon closed his eyes and let the notes wash over him, each one a small wound and a small healing simultaneously. He thought about Marcus, about the promise they had made to grow old together, about the future that had been stolen by a bullet in a schoolyard in Panama. He thought about the weight of Marcus's body as he carried it through hostile territory, about the way his friend's blood had soaked through his uniform and dried against his skin, about the nightmares that still woke him in whatever doorway or underpass he had found for shelter. He thought about the grave he visited whenever he could reach it, about the words he whispered to the headstone, about the one-sided conversations that were the only communication left to them. Still here, brother, he thought as the final note of taps faded into silence. Still trying. General Hayes leaned toward him as the crowd began to shift, preparing to disperse. Vernon, he said quietly, we need to talk about what comes next. Vernon opened his eyes. The ceremony had ended, but something else had begun, something he had not anticipated and was not certain he was ready for. The crowd was not dispersing normally. People were moving toward him, veterans and families and strangers who had witnessed what had happened and felt compelled to respond. They approached with hands extended and words of gratitude on their lips, with offers of help that ranged from meals to housing to things Vernon could not quite process. He had spent 4 years becoming invisible, learning to move through the world without drawing attention, perfecting the art of existing in the spaces that everyone else ignored. And now, in the span of a single morning, that invisibility had been stripped away. He was seen again. He was known again. He was being pulled back into a world he had deliberately abandoned. The weight of it pressed against his chest, making each breath a small battle. He did not know if he could carry what they were offering. He did not know if he deserved to carry it. He only knew that the choice he had made 5 years ago, the choice to walk away from everything and everyone, was being unmade by forces he had not invited and could not control. General Hayes seemed to sense his struggle. He placed a hand on Vernon's shoulder, the touch light but grounding, an anchor in the storm of attention that was building around them. "One step at a time," the general said. "That is how we do this. One step, and then the next. You remember how to march, Vernon. You just have to remember that marching forward is still an option." Vernon looked at the hand on his shoulder, at the face of the man who had known him when he was whole, at the crowd that was gathering with offerings he did not know how to accept. He thought about Margaret, about what she would say if she could see him now. He thought about Marcus, about the promise to survive that his friend had extracted with his dying breath. He took a breath. He steadied himself, and he prepared to take the first step. The crowd that gathered around Vernon moved with a reverence that felt almost liturgical, each person approaching as if entering sacred space. Veterans came first, men and women whose service spanned generations from Korea to Afghanistan, their faces carrying the particular recognition of those who understood what the Tomb Guard badge meant. They did not offer handshakes so much as acknowledgments, brief contacts that communicated respect without demanding anything in return. Some simply nodded. Others spoke a few words. One elderly man in a Marine Corps cap touched his forehead in an informal salute and then turned away before Vernon could respond. The families came next. Gold Star mothers and fathers, widows and children who had grown up with absence as a constant companion. They thanked Vernon for his service in words that he had heard thousands of times, but that landed differently now, weighted with the knowledge of what his service had actually cost. A woman whose husband had died in Iraq pressed a small photograph into his hand, a picture of a young soldier in desert camouflage smiling at the camera. "He would have wanted to meet you," she said. "He used to tell me about the Tomb Guards, about how they represented everything he believed in." Vernon held the photograph with hands that trembled slightly, looking at a face he had never seen but somehow recognized. General Hayes remained at his side throughout, a steady presence that helped Vernon navigate the waves of attention. The general intercepted those whose enthusiasm threatened to overwhelm, redirected conversations that grew too intense, created small bubbles of space when Vernon's breathing grew shallow. It was a kindness that Vernon had not expected and did not know how to repay, this protection offered by a man who owed him nothing. Command Sergeant Major Pryor had positioned herself nearby, speaking with reporters who had materialized from the crowd, their press credentials visible on lanyards around their necks. She was telling Vernon's story in broad strokes, providing context that would shape how the incident was understood. She spoke of his 15 years at the tomb, his Silver Star, his contributions to ceremonial drill that persisted decades after his retirement. She did not speculate about his homelessness or his reasons for disappearing from the veteran community. Those details, her tone implied, were not hers to share. Captain Bosch had retreated to the edge of the gathering, surrounded by the MPs who had accompanied him during the confrontation. His face carried the gray pallor of a man watching his future collapse in real time. The phones that had recorded his cruelty were now connected to networks that would carry those images around the world. By nightfall, his name would be attached to a story of arrogance and failure that would follow him for the rest of his career. By morning, the demands for accountability would begin. Vernon did not look at him. There was no satisfaction to be found in the captain's downfall, no vindication that could undo the words that had been spoken or the hands that had gripped his arm. Bosch was a symptom of something larger, a system that trained officers to see uniforms instead of men, that measured worth by appearance rather than substance. Destroying one captain would not cure the disease. It would only create a warning that others might or might not heed. Elena Marchetti approached as the initial wave of well-wishers began to thin. She moved through the crowd with the quiet determination of someone who had learned that waiting rarely produced results, that the things worth having usually required reaching out and taking them. She stopped in front of Vernon and looked at him with eyes that held no pity, only the clear-eyed recognition of shared experience. "I recorded everything," she said. Her voice was steady, matter-of-fact, the voice of a woman who had survived too much to be shaken by anything as simple as public confrontation. "I was not trying to catch anyone doing wrong. I was just recording for myself, for memories." But I caught it all. The way he treated you. The way you stood there and took it. The way they realized who you were. Vernon met her gaze. He saw the grief she carried, the weight of a son buried too young, the husband lost to a heart that broke under the strain of mourning. He saw strength forged in fire that never stopped burning. He saw himself. "Thank you," he said. The words fell inadequate, but he did not know what else to offer. Elena shook her head slightly. "Do not thank me yet. I'm going to post that video. I'm going to make sure people see what happened here today. Not to punish that captain, though he deserves it, but because people need to see the heroes do not always look like what we expect. People need to understand that the man they pass on the street might be the man who shaped the ceremonies that honor their children." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice had softened. "My son Michael used to say that the tomb guards were the best of us. He said they represented everything the military was supposed to be. Discipline, sacrifice, devotion to something larger than yourself." She reached out and touched Vernon's arm, her fingers light on the same spot where Bosch's grip had left bruises. "He would have been honored to meet you. I'm honored to have seen you today." Vernon felt something crack inside him, some wall he had built to keep the world at a distance. The touch was gentle, nothing like the captain's cruelty, but it broke through defenses that force could never have breached. He had spent 4 years avoiding human contact, for years convincing himself that isolation was protection, for years forgetting what it felt like to be seen by someone who understood. "Your son sounds like a fine soldier," Vernon managed. His voice came out rough, scraped raw by emotions he had not permitted himself to feel. "I'm sorry he is not here." Elena smiled, and the smile held grief and gratitude in equal measure. "He is here," she said. "All of them are here. That is why we come to these ceremonies, is it not? To remember that they're still with us, still watching, still hoping we will live in ways that honor what they gave." She released his arm and stepped back. "The video will be online within the hour. I wanted you to know before it happens. Your life is about to change, Sergeant Tate. I hope the change brings you somewhere better than where you have been." She turned and walked away before Vernon could respond, disappearing into the crowd that was slowly dispersing now that the ceremony had ended and the confrontation had resolved. Vernon watched her go, this woman who had lost everything and somehow kept moving, who had witnessed his humiliation and chosen to transform it into something that might help others see differently. General Hayes appeared at his elbow. "She's right, you know. That video is going to spread fast. By tonight, every news outlet in the country will be running some version of this story." He paused, his expression thoughtful. "You're going to need somewhere to stay. Somewhere quiet, away from the attention, where you can figure out what comes next." Vernon shook his head slowly. "I do not know what comes next. I have not known for 5 years. I just kept walking because stopping felt like dying." The general nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "Then maybe it is time to stop walking and see what happens. Maybe it is time to let someone else carry the weight for a while." He reached into his coat and produced a card, plain white with a phone number and address. "My daughter runs a veteran transition program. Not the VA, nothing official. Just a place where people who have seen too much can learn to live with what they have seen. No paperwork, no bureaucracy. Just a bed and people who understand." Vernon took the card. The paper felt impossibly light in his hand, lighter than it had any right to be given what it represented. A bed, people who understand. Things he had not allowed himself to want for so long that wanting them felt like learning a forgotten language. "I do not know if I can," he said. Hayes smiled, and the smile held patience that had been earned through decades of leading men who doubted themselves. "Nobody knows if they can. That is not the question. The question is whether you are willing to try." The crowd had thinned to a scattering of families visiting individual graves, their private griefs resuming now that the public ceremony had concluded. Vernon stood amid the white headstones with General Hayes's card still in his hand, the paper growing soft from the moisture of his palm. The November wind had picked up, carrying the smell of coming snow, and Vernon felt the cold seeping through his threadbare jacket in ways that reminded him how long he had been standing still. He needed to move. Movement was safety. Movement was survival. Movement was the only thing that had kept him alive through 4 winters on the streets. The constant walking that generated enough heat to prevent freezing, that kept his blood flowing and his mind occupied and his grief at a distance that could be managed. Standing still meant thinking. Thinking meant remembering. Remembering meant drowning in waters that had no bottom. But his feet would not obey the old commands. They remained planted on the frost-covered grass, rooted in place by something stronger than habit. Perhaps it was the weight of recognition that had been pressed upon him. Perhaps it was the general's hand on his shoulder or Elena Marchetti's gentle touch on his arm. Perhaps it was simply exhaustion, the accumulated fatigue of 4 years spent running from a grief that had finally caught up with him. Command Sergeant Major Pryor approached as the last reporters departed, her civilian coat pulled tight against the wind. She had finished her interviews, had shaped the story that would carry Vernon's name into headlines he had never sought. Now she stood before him with eyes that held questions she was too respectful to ask aloud. "Sergeant Tate," she said, and the formality of the address carried its own kind of honor. "I wanted to tell you something before I leave. Something I should have said earlier." Vernon looked at her, at the woman who had recognized him when no one else could see past the worn clothes and weathered face. She had called him Sentinel. She had spoken the word that had defined him for 15 years, the word that still lived in his bones despite everything that had happened since. He waited for her to continue. "When I was training for Tomb Guard," she said, "there was a manual in the ready room, dog-eared, held together with tape, annotations in the margins written by hand. Our instructors told us it was sacred. They told us that every correction in that manual had been earned through thousands of hours of practice, through the accumulated wisdom of sentinels who had walked the marble before us." She paused, her voice catching slightly. "They told us the annotations were written by a man named Vernon Tate. They told us he was a legend. They told us that if we ever achieved half of what he had achieved, we would be worthy of the badge." Vernon's chest tightened. He had written those annotations decades ago, sitting in the ready room during the quiet hours between shifts, trying to capture in words what his body had learned through endless repetition. He had not known the manual survived. He had not known anyone still read what he had written. "I read those annotations every night before I walked," Pryor continued. "I memorized them. I carried them with me in my heart during every shift, during every moment I stood at that marble and wondered if I was good enough." Her eyes glistened, but her voice remained steady. "You shaped me, Sergeant Tate. You shaped every sentinel who came after you. And when I saw you standing there today, taking that captain's abuse with the same stillness we were trained to achieve, I knew. I knew before I saw the tattoo. I knew because your stillness was the stillness I had spent 3 years trying to learn." Vernon did not trust himself to speak. The words she offered were too large, too heavy with meaning he had not expected to carry. He had written those annotations to help others. He had not imagined that decades later, someone would stand before him and speak of them as if they were scripture. Pryor reached into her pocket and withdrew something small, pressing it into Vernon's hand alongside the general's card. A challenge coin, he realized, the brass worn smooth by years of handling. On one face, the Tomb Guard badge. On the other, an inscription he could not read in the fading afternoon light. "That coin was given to me by my sergeant of the guard when I completed my service," Pryor said. "It has been with me through 2 combat deployments and 15 years of service since. I wanted to have it." Vernon shook his head, tried to return the coin. "I cannot take this. This is yours. This is your history." Pryor closed his fingers around the coin with both hands. "My history began with your words," she said. "Everything I achieved started with annotations you wrote in a manual you probably forgot about decades ago. Taking this coin is not charity, Sergeant. It is acknowledgement. It is me telling you that your service did not end when you retired. It continued through everyone you taught, everyone you shaped, everyone who walked the marble, carrying your wisdom in their hearts." She released his hands and stepped back. "General Hayes has good people in his daughter's program. I have sent veterans there myself. It is not about fixing what is broken. It is about remembering that broken things can still have purpose. Vernon stood in the November cold with a card in one hand and a challenge coin in the other, the weight of both pressing against his palms like anchors trying to hold him in place. The wind cut through his jacket, and he shivered, and he realized that he was tired in ways that sleep could not address. He was tired of walking. He was tired of running. He was tired of carrying weight that never grew lighter no matter how far he traveled. Pryor turned to leave, then paused and looked back over her shoulder. "The video is already spreading," she said. "By morning, everyone will know your name. You cannot go back to being invisible, Sergeant. The question is what you do with being seen." She walked away across the frost-covered grass, her footsteps leaving dark prints that the wind would erase within the hour. Vernon watched her go, this woman who had spoken words that cracked open something he had sealed shut years ago. He thought about the annotations he had written, about the sentinels who had read them, about the chain of knowledge and tradition that extended from his hands to theirs across decades of service. He had believed his purpose ended when Margaret died. He had believed that everything meaningful about his life was buried in two graves, one in Panama and one in a quiet cemetery where his wife lay beside the plot reserved for him. He had believed that walking away was the only honorable response to a grief that refused to fade. But Pryor's words suggested something different. They suggested that purpose could persist beyond personal catastrophe, that service could continue even when the servant was broken, that the things he had given did not disappear simply because he had stopped being able to see them. He looked down at the challenge coin in his palm. The brass caught the last light of the November afternoon, glowing faintly gold against his weathered skin. On the inscription side, he could now read the words that had been carved into the metal. "We guard the unknown, but we are not unknown to each other." Vernon closed his fingers around the coin and felt something shift inside him. Not healing, not yet, but something like the first movement of ice beginning to thaw after a long winter. Something like the possibility that movement might eventually lead somewhere other than away. The cemetery had grown quiet in the hour since the ceremony ended. Most families had departed, leaving only the white headstones standing their eternal watch over the November afternoon. Vernon remained among them, unable to leave yet uncertain where leaving would take him. The card and the coin sat heavy in his pocket, twin weights that represented futures he had not allowed himself to imagine. He walked without destination, his feet carrying him along paths worn smooth by generations of mourners. The frost had begun to melt where the afternoon sun reached between the bare trees, creating patches of wet grass that darkened his cracked boots. He did not notice. His attention had turned inward, toward the memories that the day had stirred from the sediment where he had tried to bury them. Margaret would have loved this place. She had always found peace in cemeteries, in the quiet contemplation they demanded, in a way they forced the living to remember that life was borrowed time. She had taken him to cemeteries on their anniversaries, walking among the headstones and reading names aloud, as if speaking them could bring the dead briefly back to presence. She had said that remembering was a form of prayer, that every name spoken was a small resurrection. He had not visited her grave in 4 years. He had not been able to bear it, the finality of that headstone, the dates carved in granite that marked the boundaries of everything they had been together. He had fled from her burial before the last prayer was spoken, had walked out of the cemetery, and kept walking until the walking became its own purpose and the destination ceased to matter. He had told himself he was honoring her by surviving, but survival without presence was its own kind of death. His feet stopped without his permission. He had reached a section of the cemetery he did not recognize, a newer area where the headstones were lighter in color and the grass had not yet achieved the smooth uniformity of the older sections. The names here were recent. The flowers were fresh. The grief was still raw enough to leave traces in the air. One headstone caught his attention. The name carved into its face was Marcus Webb. Vernon's breath stopped. His heart stuttered in his chest, and then resumed at a rhythm that felt wrong, too fast and too shallow. He had known that Marcus was buried here. He had known for 35 years exactly where his brother lay, had memorized the section and row and plot number without ever allowing himself to visit. The knowledge had lived in him like shrapnel, a fragment of metal too dangerous to remove, too painful to ignore. And now his feet had carried him here without conscious intent, as if some part of him had always known where he needed to go. He approached the headstone slowly, each step an act of will that cost more than any physical exertion he had ever endured. The grass beneath his boots was soft and recently tended. Someone had been caring for this grave, keeping it neat, leaving flowers that were only a few days old. Someone had been doing the remembering that Vernon had failed to do. He stopped before the stone and read the inscription that he had never allowed himself to see. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, United States Army. Beloved son, brother, friend. December 20th, 1989. Greater love hath no man than this. The words blurred as tears filled Vernon's eyes for the first time in years. He had not cried when Margaret died. He had not cried during the 4 years of walking that followed. He had sealed the tears behind walls so thick that he had forgotten they existed. But now, standing before the grave of the brother who had died in his arms, those walls crumbled like sand against the tide. He sank to his knees on the wet grass, heedless of the cold that soaked through his worn pants. His hands pressed against the headstone as if he could reach through the granite and touch the man who lay beneath. The sobs that emerged from his chest were ugly, raw sounds that he could not control and did not try to. 35 years of grief poured out of him in waves that left him gasping, drowning in waters he had fled for so long that he had forgotten how to swim. I am sorry, he managed between sobs. I'm sorry I never came. I am sorry I could not save you. I am sorry I have been running instead of remembering. The headstone offered no response. The dead kept their own counsel, their silence both a mercy and a cruelty. But Vernon continued speaking, the words tumbling out in a flood that had been dammed too long. You told me I got them out. You told me that was what mattered. But I could not make it matter, Marcus. I could not make any of it matter after you were gone. I stood at that tomb for 15 more years, guarding the unknown dead. And every day, I thought about you lying here alone. I thought about the promise we made to grow old together. I thought about your laugh and your terrible jokes and the way you could make anyone feel like they belonged. He paused, his breath coming in ragged gasps. And then Margaret died, and I could not do it anymore. I could not stand still. I could not guard anything. I could not even guard myself. So I ran. I ran until I forgot how to stop running, and I told myself it was survival, but it was just another kind of dying. The afternoon light had begun to fade, the sun dropping toward the horizon and casting long shadows across the graves. Vernon remained on his knees, his hands still pressed against the cold granite, his tears still falling onto grass that had been watered by decades of grief before his. Someone has been tending your grave, he said, his voice steadier now. Someone has been leaving flowers. I do not know who. Maybe your family. Maybe one of the men we served with. Maybe just someone who reads the inscription and understands what it means. He paused, a new thought forming through the fog of emotion. You are not forgotten, Marcus. You were never forgotten. I was the only one who ran. Everyone else stayed and remembered. He thought about Pryor's words, about the annotations in the manual that had shaped generations of sentinels. He thought about Elena Marchetti's son, who had admired the tomb guards without ever meeting the man who had helped define what they were. He thought about Private Carter, whose timing was now perfect because Vernon had whispered a correction that cost nothing to give and meant everything to receive. Purpose could persist beyond catastrophe. Service could continue even when the servant was broken. The things he had given did not disappear simply because he had stopped being able to see them. Vernon reached into his pocket and withdrew the challenge coin that Pryor had given him. He held it against the headstone, letting the brass warm against the cold granite. I met a woman today who told me that my words shaped her, he said. I met a general who remembered signing my retirement papers. I met a young soldier who listened when I told him how to breathe. He pressed the coin harder against the stone, as if the pressure could transmit meaning across the boundary between living and dead. I have been telling myself that my purpose ended, but maybe purpose does not end. Maybe it just changes shape, and I was too blind to see the new shape because I was still looking for the old one. He lowered the coin and looked at the inscription one more time. Greater love hath no man than this. Marcus had given everything. Margaret had given everything. And Vernon was still here, still breathing, still capable of giving something, even if what he had left was less than what he had started with. Maybe that was enough. Maybe less than everything was still something. Maybe the first step forward did not require knowing where all the other steps would lead. He rose slowly, his knees protesting the cold and the position and the decades of wear that had accumulated since Panama. He stood before his brother's grave with the coin in one hand and the card in the other, and he made a decision that felt less like choosing and more like surrendering to something that had been pulling him forward all along. "I'm going to try," he said to the headstone. "I do not know if I can do it. I do not know if I deserve to do it. But I'm going to try. For you. For Margaret. For the kid who fixes breathing because I told him how." He touched the top of the headstone once, a gesture of farewell that was also a gesture of beginning. "I will come back," he said. "I will come back and tell you how it goes." Then he turned and walked toward the cemetery entrance, toward the card in his pocket that represented a bed and people who understood, toward whatever came next. The video reached 1 million views before Vernon had walked a mile from the cemetery gates. He did not know this because he did not have a phone, did not have access to the digital world that was rapidly transforming his story into something larger than he had ever intended. He only knew that cars were slowing as they passed him on the road, that faces were pressing against windows with expressions that held recognition instead of the usual dismissal, that something had shifted in the way the world looked at him. Elena Marchetti had titled the video simply, "Homeless Veteran Corrects Honor Guard, Gets Publicly Humiliated, Then They Learn Who He Really Is." The title was accurate, if incomplete. It captured the arc without capturing the weight, the way headlines always did. But the video itself captured everything. The captain's contempt, Vernon's stillness, Pryor's recognition, the general's embrace. 2,000 people watching a legend emerge from the shadows of their assumptions. The comment section had become a torrent within the first hour. Veterans shared their own stories of being dismissed and diminished. Active duty soldiers expressed shame at their captain's behavior. Civilians confessed to the assumptions they made about the homeless people they passed every day. Someone had already started a fundraising campaign. Someone else had identified Captain Bosch by name and was demanding his removal from service. The machinery of public attention had engaged, and it would not stop until it had extracted every possible consequence from the raw material of that November morning. Vernon walked toward the address on General Hayes's card, each step carrying him further from the cemetery and closer to something he could not quite envision. The transition program was housed in a converted warehouse on the outskirts of the city, far enough from the ceremonial grounds that the journey would take hours on foot. He did not mind the walking. Walking was familiar. Walking gave him time to think, to process, to prepare himself for whatever waited at the destination. The sun had fully set by the time he reached the warehouse district. Streetlights cast pools of orange light across cracked pavement and chain-link fences, illuminating loading docks and shuttered businesses that had seen better decades. The address led him to a building that looked like all the others from the outside, anonymous and industrial, giving no indication of what happened within its walls. A sign beside the door read Sentinel House. No other explanation. No logos or slogans or mission statements. Just the name and a small light that suggested someone was home. Vernon stood before the door for a long moment, his hand raised to knock, but not yet making contact. The fear that gripped him was not the fear of danger, but the fear of hope, the terror of allowing himself to want something after years of training himself to want nothing. He had survived by reducing his needs to their bare minimum, by eliminating desire and expectation and the vulnerability they created. Walking through this door meant reversing that process, opening himself to disappointment and failure and all the other risks that came with caring about outcomes. The door opened before he could knock. A woman stood in the entrance, perhaps 50 years old, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that held the particular steadiness of someone who had seen enough suffering to be unsurprised by its variations. She wore jeans and a flannel shirt, no uniform or insignia, nothing to suggest authority beyond the quiet competence of her presence. "You must be Vernon," she said. Her voice was warm without being pitying, welcoming without being effusive. "My father called ahead. He said you might be coming." Vernon lowered his hand. "Your father is General Hayes." The woman smiled. "He has not been a general for 10 years, but he still acts like one. I am Rachel. I run this place." She stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. "No paperwork tonight. No intake forms or assessments or any of the bureaucratic nonsense that makes the VA so exhausting. Tonight, there's just a bed, a hot meal, and people who will not ask questions you're not ready to answer." Vernon crossed the threshold. The interior of the warehouse had been transformed into something that felt more like a home than an institution. Exposed brick walls had been softened with tapestries and photographs. Mismatched furniture created clusters of seating around a central common area. A kitchen occupied one corner, the smell of something savory drifting from pots on the stove. Hallways led to what Vernon assumed were sleeping quarters, doors closed against the privacy that residents needed and deserved. A handful of people occupied the common area, men and women whose ages spanned several decades, whose faces carried the particular weariness of those who had served and struggled and somehow survived. They looked up as Vernon entered, their expressions curious but not intrusive. One of them, an older man with a prosthetic leg visible beneath his shorts, raised a coffee mug in greeting. Another, a woman with close-cropped hair and tattoos climbing both arms, nodded once and returned to the book she was reading. "They know," Rachel said quietly, following his gaze. "The video is everywhere, but they also know what it feels like to have your worst moments broadcast to the world. No one here will treat you like a celebrity or a victim. You are just another veteran trying to figure out what comes next." Vernon felt something loosen in his chest, some tension he had not realized he was carrying. He had expected fanfare or scrutiny, the weight of expectation that recognition usually brought. Instead, he found only quiet acceptance, the simple acknowledgement that he was one of them, no more and no less. Rachel led him to a small room at the end of one hallway. The space was modest but clean, containing a single bed with fresh sheets, a small desk, a lamp that cast warm light against the brick walls. A window looked out over the warehouse district, streetlights visible in the darkness, the city continuing its business beyond the sanctuary these walls provided. "This is yours for as long as you need it," Rachel said. "No time limits. No conditions. The only rule is that you treat others here with the same respect you want to receive." She paused at the door, her hand resting on the frame. "My father told me about your service. 15 years at the tomb, the Silver Star, the manual annotations that shaped generations of sentinels." She shook her head slowly. "He also told me about your wife, about the years on the street, about the captain who did not see what he was looking at." Vernon stood in the center of the small room, surrounded by walls that did not move, beneath a roof that would keep out the November cold. He had not slept indoors in 4 years. He had forgotten what it felt like to have a door that closed, a bed that was his, a space where he could simply exist without watching for threats or planning his next move. "I do not know how to do this," he said. The words came out before he could stop them, raw and honest in a way he had not permitted himself to be in years. "I do not know how to stop moving. I do not know how to let people help. I do not know how to be anything other than what I have become." Rachel nodded, as if this confession was exactly what she had expected. "Nobody does," she said. "That is why we start with small things. Tonight, you eat a hot meal and sleep in a warm bed. Tomorrow, you wake up and see how you feel. The day after that, maybe you talk to someone. Or maybe you do not. There is no schedule for healing, Vernon. There is just the willingness to try." She left him alone in the room, the door clicking softly shut behind her. Vernon stood motionless for a long moment, listening to the sounds of the building around him. Distant conversation, the clink of dishes in the kitchen, footsteps in the hallway. The ordinary sounds of people living their lives, sounds that had become foreign to him during his years of solitude. He sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress gave beneath his weight, soft in a way that felt almost decadent after years of concrete and cardboard. He ran his hands over the sheets, feeling the clean cotton, the warmth that promised a night without shivering. Then he reached into his pocket and withdrew the challenge coin Pryor had given him. He placed it on the small desk beside the lamp, where the brass caught the light and glowed like a small sun against the darkness outside the window. We guard the unknown, but we are not unknown to each other. Vernon lay back on the bed, his boots still on, his jacket still wrapped around him like armor he was not yet ready to remove. The ceiling above him was solid, unchanging, a boundary between himself and the sky that had been his only roof for 4 years. He closed his eyes and waited for sleep to find him in this strange new sanctuary. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he was not afraid of what the morning might bring. 3 months had passed since the November morning that changed everything. The video had been viewed 47 million times. Captain Raymond Bosch had resigned his commission following an investigation that revealed a pattern of conduct unbecoming an officer. The Secretary of the Army had issued a public apology to Vernon Tate and announced new training protocols for recognizing and respecting veterans regardless of their circumstances. Elena Marchetti had become an advocate for homeless veteran awareness, channeling her grief for Michael into purpose that honored his memory. And Vernon had learned to sleep through the night without waking to check for threats that no longer existed. He stood now in the common room of Sentinel House, surrounded by faces that had become familiar over the weeks of slow rebuilding. The man with the prosthetic leg was named Franklin, a Marine who had lost his limb and his marriage in the same year, and had found his way here after 3 years of wandering. The woman with the tattoos was Desiree, an Army medic who had saved countless lives overseas and then discovered that saving herself was a different kind of mission entirely. There were others, a rotating population of veterans in various stages of recovery, each carrying weights that outsiders could not see. Vernon had become something unexpected among them. Not a leader, exactly, but a presence that others gravitated toward. His stillness, the same stillness that had defined his years at the tomb, created space for people to speak without feeling judged. His silence invited confession. His survival offered proof that the worst moments did not have to be the final moments. Rachel had noticed this quality and had begun asking Vernon to sit with new arrivals during their first nights. He did not counsel them or offer advice. He simply sat, his presence a wordless assurance that they were not alone, that someone understood the particular terror of stopping after years of running. Some of them talked. Some of them wept. Some of them simply sat in silence beside him until the silence became comfortable enough to bear. Today was different. Today, Private First Class Deshaun Carter stood in the entrance of Sentinel House, his dress uniform immaculate, his young face carrying an expression that mixed nervousness with determination. He had contacted Rachel through official channels, requesting permission to visit, explaining that he had something he needed to deliver in person. Vernon watched the young soldier cross the common room, watched the eyes of the other residents track his movement with the wary attention that uniforms sometimes provoked in spaces dedicated to healing from what uniforms represented. Carter stopped in front of Vernon and snapped to attention with the precision that Vernon had helped him achieve on that November morning. "At ease," Vernon said, and the words felt strange in his mouth, the language of command returning after years of disuse. "You did not need to come all this way." Carter relaxed his posture, but remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back in a parade rest that was clearly habitual. "I did, Sergeant. I needed to thank you properly. I needed to give you this." He reached into his uniform jacket and withdrew an envelope, plain white, bearing the seal of the United States Army. He held it out to Vernon with both hands, the gesture carrying ceremonial weight that transformed a simple delivery into something more significant. Vernon took the envelope. His name was printed on the front in official typeface, the letters crisp and black against the white paper. He opened it carefully, unfolding the document inside with hands that no longer trembled the way they had in those first weeks at Sentinel House. The letter was from the commanding general of the Military District of Washington. It informed Vernon that he had been selected to receive a formal recognition at the upcoming Veterans Day ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery. The recognition would honor his 15 years of service as a sentinel, his contributions to ceremonial drill that continued to shape the honor guard, and his Silver Star actions in Panama. The letter requested his presence and noted that transportation and accommodations would be provided. Vernon read the words twice before he understood what they meant. He looked up at Carter, at the young soldier whose timing error had started the chain of events that led to this moment. "Did you have something to do with this?" he asked. Carter shook his head. "Not directly, Sergeant. But after that day, I started asking questions. I started learning about the history of the Tomb Guard, about the men and women who walked before me. I learned about your annotations, about the manual you shaped, about everything you gave to the service." He paused, his voice thickening with emotion. "And I started talking to other soldiers about what I learned. I told them about the homeless man who corrected my breathing and turned out to be a legend. I told them that we should not wait for people to prove their worth before we treat them with respect." Vernon folded the letter and returned it to its envelope. The weight of it in his hands was not the weight of paper, but the weight of recognition, of a world that had finally seen what he had tried so hard to hide. "You did more than correct my timing that day," Carter continued. "You reminded me why I wanted to serve in the first place. Not for the uniform or the ceremonies. For the chance to be part of something that matters. For the chance to honor people who gave everything." He straightened slightly, his posture shifting back toward attention. "I'm going to be a sentinel, Sergeant. I applied for Tomb Guard training last month. I want to walk the marble the way you walked it. I want to carry your legacy forward." Vernon felt the tears threatening again. The same tears that had broken free at Marcus's grave, and that came more easily now that he had stopped trying to dam them. He rose from his chair and extended his hand to the young soldier. "You will make a fine sentinel," he said. "Remember that every step is a prayer. Remember that the dead are counting on you to get it right. And remember that someday, decades from now, you might find yourself correcting some young soldier's breathing, and you will understand that the chain never breaks. It just adds new links." Carter took his hand, and the grip between them was firm and warm and full of meaning that words could not fully capture. Then the young soldier released him, stepped back, and rendered a salute that was perfect in its precision and genuine in its respect. Vernon returned the salute. His form was rusty, his arm not as sharp as it had once been, but the gesture carried the weight of everything he had been and everything he was becoming. Carter departed with a final nod, leaving Vernon standing in the common room with the letter in his hand and the future stretching out before him like a road he had finally found the courage to walk. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that heroes do not always look like what we expect, please subscribe to our channel. And tell us in the comments below, who is the quiet hero in your life who deserves recognition? Who is the person whose service goes unseen, whose sacrifices are invisible to everyone except those who know where to look? Sometimes the greatest warriors are not the ones still in uniform. Sometimes they're the ones who learned that the hardest battle is finding the strength to accept help after years of standing alone. Thank you for watching. That evening, Vernon walked to the cemetery where Marcus lay. The headstone was unchanged, the inscription still reading, "Greater love hath no man than this," but the flowers beside it were fresh. Vernon had been leaving them himself now, every week, maintaining the grave that someone else had tended during his years of absence. He knelt on the grass and spoke to his brother. "They want to honor me at Arlington," he said. "They want to put me on a stage and thank me for things I did decades ago." He paused, touching the cold granite. "I do not know if I deserve it. I do not know if I will ever feel like I deserve anything good. But I'm going to go. I'm going to stand there and accept what they offer, because refusing would be its own kind of cowardice." The wind stirred the bare branches overhead, carrying the smell of winter approaching. "I'm still here, Marcus. Still trying. And I finally understand what you meant when you said getting them out was what mattered. It was never about me deserving to survive. It was about what I could do with the survival. It was about the links in the chain that I could help create." He rose slowly, his knees protesting but holding. "I will keep coming back," he said. "Every week, every year, until I am lying beside you, and someone else is leaving flowers for both of us." He touched the headstone one final time, then turned and walked back toward Sentinel House, toward the bed that waited for him, toward the morning that would bring new opportunities to help others find their way out of the shadows. The chain never breaks. It just adds new links. And Vernon Tate, Sentinel, Silver Star recipient, keeper of the unknown dead, had finally found his place among the living.